Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about and playing one of the great piano sonatas, a set piece in any pianist's repertoire, one of the most popular of the Beethoven sonatas, usually known as the Tempest. So first of all, let's actually talk about that title, the Tempest. It doesn't come from Beethoven. It's just known as the Sonata Opus 31, number 2 in D minor. We have to be a little bit careful about the word tempest. First of all, the story is that Beethoven's secretary, Anton Schindler, who wasn't terribly reliable anyway, in fact sometimes he's been nicknamed Anton Swindler, he remembered a conversation with Beethoven where he asked Beethoven the meaning of the D minor sonata, Opus 31, number 2, and the F minor sonata, Opus 57. Of course, I don't need to tell you that that is always called the Appassionata. So Schindler asked Beethoven the meaning of these two sonatas, and Beethoven said, "Read Shakespeare's Tempest." So this means that the word tempest can equally apply to the Appassionata sonata. Perhaps it's more appropriate for that, because that's a very tempestuous piece throughout, whereas only the first movement of the Tempest Sonata is tempestuous. But by the time Schindler had published this story, the nickname Appassionata had already been attached to Opus 57, so by default it got attached to Opus 31, number 2. Now, by all means call it the Tempest, but don't think too much about that meaning the actual character of the piece. It certainly only applies to the first movement. However, there's another sense in which the Tempest Sonata, I'll just call it that, is the most Shakespearean of his sonatas, because of course the Tempest refers to Shakespeare rather than just meaning a storm, although there's a famous storm at the beginning of the play, The Tempest. So, first of all, D minor, which is the key of the Tempest Sonata, seems to be, as it were, Beethoven's Shakespearean key. There are other examples. There's the slow movement of the string quartet, Opus 18, number 1, which Beethoven said was something to do with the scene in the vault from Romeo and Juliet. There's the great Largo from the piano trio, Opus 70, number 1, which is known as the Ghost on account of that slow movement, which is to do with some sketches for a projected opera on the subject of Macbeth. Finally, of course, there's the Ninth Symphony, which we could perhaps say is the most Shakespearean of the symphonies. I don't know, maybe I'm stretching a point too far. But there does seem to be this link between D minor, Shakespeare, the Tempest, and this sonata. Finally, we might refer to Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, of which the famous key is D minor, for the overture, for the scene with the commendatore, and all the rest of it. And that we could perhaps refer to as Mozart's most Shakespearean opera. So here we go. The first question I would like to ask now is, do we think of Beethoven as a classical composer? I don't mean classical in the sense of all the Western concert music, but in the strictly historical sense. Is he a classical composer or is he something else? I would like to suggest that he is in reality a transitional composer. By the way, the great pianist Arthur Rubinstein insisted that Beethoven was a romantic composer, and I think there's no harm done in thinking of him closer to that than to being a classical composer. Of course, he came out of the classical period. His teacher was Haydn. He worshipped Mozart. He was very well schooled in Bach. By the way, both Johann Sebastian and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who's an important precursor of the classical era. But right from the very beginning, he had this creative urge to develop the classical style and to express altogether deeper, more intense emotion with it, more personal emotion. And of course, this is a characteristic of the Romantic era. When he died in 1827, Chopin and Schumann were already 17 years old. Mendelssohn had written his two miraculous teenage pieces, the String Octet and the Midsummer Night's Dream Overture. So the whole musical language had moved on by then anyway, partly, of course, due to the towering influence of Beethoven himself, who never stopped developing. I believe he once said quite late on in his life, "Art demands of us that we do not stand still." And also, he was in a way the first professional freelance composer. He wasn't composing to the order of church or state or aristocratic patrons. Nevertheless, at this era, he was still very grateful for his aristocratic patrons, who were educated music lovers, often pupils of his, who appreciated his music and wanted to support it, and without which he couldn't have lived as a freelance composer. He would have had to take a job, which indeed he tried several times to do, even quite late on in life, but perhaps fortunately for us, he never actually succeeded in having any permanent position. So he remained a highly self-willed, professional, artistic composer, where nearly every piece represents his absolute considered wish of how he wanted to express himself and move the language on.